Salesforce admins, are you ready to articulate the value that you bring to your organization? My name's Leanne Reimel, and this is Expert Corner, where we sit down with Salesforce experts to dive into the tips and tricks that will help you, our Salesforce admins. Today, I'm going to sit down with Susanna Plaisted, who's an architect evangelist here at Salesforce, and she has tons of experience with helping technical members of our community, architects, admins, developers, build their personal value story. She's going to talk about why it's important and why you should start building your personal value story today. And as always, please make all purchasing decisions based on currently available technology. Let's go meet Susanna. Hello, Susanna. Thank you so much for joining us here today on Expert Corner.
Hello, Leanne. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. I'm really excited.
Well, we are thrilled to have you on. I know many of our viewers probably know you from the community, but we also often have tons of new viewers who might not have met you yet. So before we get started, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your background, your Salesforce background, and what brought you to Salesforce?
Absolutely. So I started out as an accidental admin, actually working in a music nonprofit. I studied viola in college, so I did not study computer science. I sort of, like a lot of you, it just fell into a Salesforce career sort of by accident. And over the years, got more skills, learned how to read and write code, did a little bit of development, and then eventually started working in an IT department and set my sights on the architect role and worked as an architect in the ecosystem with customers and with a partner, and then eventually found my way to Salesforce as an architect evangelist.
I love your career path. I think, you were one of the first architects that I really saw really visible out in the community. And, I remember before you joined Salesforce and now since you joined Salesforce, just advocating for architects, advocating for people to become architects, how people can build that career path and build, really whatever technical career path makes sense for them. At Dreamforce 22, you had a really valuable session. See how I use the very valuable session about building your architect value story. And I really enjoyed your session. I know a ton of community members got a lot of value from your session. And I was really excited. One of the things I was really excited about with your session is it was about building that architect value story, but it seemed like those fundamentals in the advice you were giving could be incredibly helpful for not just architects, but also admins.
Absolutely. I think the concept of a personal value story really can extend to anyone working in a technical field. And frankly, I think there's a lot of overlap between architects and admins and the resources that are useful for them. So I think this is a great example of one of those.
So I really want to jump in and talk about, the how and what is the structure of a value story. But first, we really should talk about why and what.
Yes.
So when you say your personal value story, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, to me, it means communicating your value, the value that you bring to your employer where you work. And also, to me, especially, it means that unique value that you not just doing, these responsibilities at my job, but above and beyond that, it's the sort of the metrics and the measures of how you've brought value and how you're adding value to the company that you work for today or the company that you want to work for in the future.
And it's so important. I think one of my takeaways from your session is really thinking about that, building a narrative, building your story, your personal value story around both that qualitative and quantitative true value that you're providing to your organization, to your career, and being able to tell that story of here's why I am so important to the business. Because I know I hear from admins a lot, and we talk about this in our community a lot, how important it is to be able to articulate, why your role is so important, why you in your role is so important.
Absolutely. And I think you really hit on that, speaking about the narrative, because that's so important. And when you think about a story, forget the value part for a second. When you think about a story that you want to tell and the narrative that you want to tell, the first thing that you have to think about is the audience that you're communicating with. And that's true with a personal value story as well. And the audience that you're communicating with, I think the first important thing to remember is that they're not as technical as you are most of the time. You're speaking with maybe your manager or with a hiring manager, with a board or executives, and they're not as familiar with, frankly, they're not as familiar with Salesforce as you are. Mm-hmm. So keeping that in mind when you're trying to explain what you've done and the value that you've added to the company, you need to make sure that you're defining, what do you consider to be a metric? How are you defining the work that you've done? And really, that's a key part of why you should even care about a personal value story, is being able to explain the importance of the work that you're doing to both technical and non-technical stakeholders.
Can we dive into that a little bit? Because that is so important, being able to kind of shift how you're talking about value. And I think,
yes, I do. Absolutely. So I have a bit of a formula. So maybe something that admins are familiar with and love. I have a bit of a formula for you on how you can construct a really good value story. So what I've seen, even just by looking at folks' resumes or LinkedIn profiles, is that a lot of the times when we're communicating with folks who are in the ecosystem and who know Salesforce, it can be enough to say, here's what I did. Here's what I configured. Maybe I built a report that, did X, Y, and Z, or I built a flow that brought together this information. And you get into that nitty gritty of like what you actually built in Salesforce. And that can be great when you're maybe talking to a community group or when you're showing off a solution that you've built. But when you're talking with executives or when you're talking with your manager, sometimes getting down into that level of just the solution isn't enough. And so what I recommend and what the formula is for a great value story is bringing together that solution, but also adding the business challenge that you've solved. Mm-hmm. And also not monetizing, but measuring the value that you have as well using an actual metric. So it's that business value, that solution, and the metric that you're using to measure your value all together. Mm-hmm. And that's what results in a great value story. And I can give you an example. So a lot of times on resumes, I'll see, I participated or I delivered a Service Cloud implementation. And that's like a bullet on a resume that you've accomplished. And that's a big thing. That's a huge accomplishment if you know exactly what goes into a Service Cloud implementation. And even if you go a little bit deeper, maybe you say, I delivered Service Cloud, I worked with bots and with maybe the Service Console and some other items. That's great for, again, maybe a technical audience or a Salesforce audience, but what does that actually mean to the business and what did you solve? So it's really, and that is a really important piece of context, especially if you're trying to use this value story to promote your work internally at your employer, because maybe the story that you're trying to tell is different from the priorities of your manager or the executives that you're working with. So an example in the Service Cloud space, since we're using that as an example, would be, maybe you're not trying to say, well, with this bot that we introduced, we're now able to take, X% more calls. Maybe that's not the business value that your company is actually looking for. Maybe you're looking to reduce spend in the call center. And that's the story you need to tell. So it's important, again, to keep the priorities of the audience in mind. So if the story is you introduced a bot, which allows you to reduce spend in your call center, then you want to track that metric. So you want to say X%, overhead reduced in the call center versus X% volume of calls increased, because maybe that's not the story that you want to tell, because that's not what's valuable to your stakeholder in the end. So you would, instead of just saying I delivered a Service Cloud project, you could say I led, and we can talk about this in a second, but I led a Service Cloud project that resulted in X% decrease in overhead cost center spend. Mm-hmm. And you would add to that as well the business challenge that you solved. So was it maybe leveraging your existing call center staff more efficiently? Because we're not talking about, laying off folks. We're talking about enabling your folks to focus on higher order higher order interests. So weaving that in is really important as well.
That's such an important piece, diving into, does it tie to the goals of the people in the room? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of us have been in scenarios where it almost seems like people are speaking two different languages, because you're in a meeting and we haven't come to the table on what is our shared goals and priorities here. What is the goal of the meeting? What is the goal of the project? And establishing that or understanding that, tying to, if you're presenting to your business stakeholders, your business leaders. It's actually we use, of course, V2 Moms here at Salesforce. It's one of the things I find so helpful with meeting with other groups. And like you said, tying the work that you're doing or the work you've done to those priorities is really fundamental, because I always think you want to make sure that you're included when they are talking about those priorities. You want the work that you're doing to be viewed as an important, pillar to maintaining those priorities.
There's actually, you talked about V2 Moms and different ways we measure success at Salesforce, and personal value stories actually came out of an existing framework that is used internally at Salesforce, which is project value stories. Mm-hmm. So there's actually two different types when we talk about value stories. There's two different flavors, and the one that's used for personal value story is just a little more focused on the individual and what the individual accomplished versus the outcomes of the entire project. But both are really valuable, and you can use both, I think, as an architect or as an admin to communicate the value of the work that you do.
Okay, so we've talked about the formula. We've talked about the importance of really trying to deeply understand your audience and tie to their goals and priorities. And as you find your narration for your personal value story, what are some things that you've learned along the way with crafting these personal value stories? Maybe mistakes that you're aware of that can happen, or maybe some of the kind of I don't want to say pitfalls, but what are those kind of gotchas to be aware of? And also, what are some of maybe the examples of great value stories that you've seen?
Yeah. So I think the biggest pitfall to avoid is not starting to baseline your metrics early enough. So an example of that issue is if you don't have a baseline for how you're going to track. So, you want to say like percent increased or percent decreased or X amount of hours saved. If you don't measure sort of the baseline where you're starting from, it can be hard to measure it later on sometimes. So the classic example I can think of is when you're doing an org migration. So moving off an old system to a new system. If you don't measure the performance of that old system before you retire it, it can be really hard or maybe even impossible to go back and measure like, well, how long did it take for, XYZ to happen in our old system before we moved to Salesforce? So thinking about the metrics you want to measure and measuring them while you're actually doing in the middle of whatever initiative or project you're working on is really important. And that's waiting too long is an important pitfall to avoid. And then another thing that I've personally seen, especially in coaching people to write better resumes, is to use strong action verbs in your value story. So instead of saying, I delivered or I executed, things that are a little bit almost passive, like, yes, it was part of your job to, I build is sort of a neutral, I would say, but, did you lead something? Did you manage a project? What are some stronger action verbs that you can use in your story that aren't just like an example of like a weaker one would be helped? Like, did you really just help? Like, what did you do that was,
yeah, that's not very informative either.
Yeah. It's like, what did help do? Yeah. What do you mean by helped? So that would be another, so really strong value stories, I would say, use strong active verbs, and you can leverage the statements that you build together in this value story narrative anywhere. So you can leverage those in a resume, you can leverage those on LinkedIn. And I think good value stories are succinct, use strong action verbs, and can be used in multiple places to really tell the story of the value that you bring as a Salesforce admin.
So you touched on something that I want to dive into even more is what do we do with the value stories? So, admins, I know all of the admins watching this right now and architects and developers watching this are jotting down their value statements, and they're starting to think about the metrics that they want to look at. What do they do with it? Like, when do we use these value statements or these value stories?
Yeah. So I think an important takeaway is that a value story is a living document. So we have a template. So if you were like, how do I even get started creating a value story? We have a template for you on the Architect website, architect.salesforce.com. And we could probably link it down in the show notes, I'm sure.
It'll be in the show notes, don't worry.
Yeah, perfect. So we have a template for you to get started, the first thing. And the other important thing that I said is it's a living document. So this should be something that you're revisiting and keeping up to date. Even if you're like, I'm happy at my company where I am, I'm not looking to move. I haven't touched my resume in however long. I would say this is something that you should keep up to date along with your resume as well, even if you're not looking to move. On at least I would say at best a quarterly basis. I'd say at absolute minimum a yearly basis. You need to update this while you still have the projects that you're working on fresh in your mind, so that you remember all the great things that you brought to that experience. You should be updating your value story document wherever you store it, a template and another document on a at least yearly basis. And then you should be translating that to update things like your resume, like your LinkedIn profile, like your personal website. And this should be sort of that main document that can then help you update all of those different resources that are external to you facing out in the world.
Okay, so everyone's ready to start building their personal value statements, to start sharing them, to keep them maintained, to keep their resume maintained. What is the best advice, or what should admins do next? Like, if they're watching this and they're feeling a little unsure about exactly where to get started, I know you mentioned the template, and we'll definitely have that linked in the show notes. How should admins start thinking about kind of the first step of building this personal value statement?
Yeah, first step I would say is get started today. Seriously, like open up the template. Even if you don't have time to sit down and like craft this perfect, bullets that you want to put on your resume today, get started with even just like the outline of like, I know I'm working on this project right now. Like, what are you physically doing in your job when you close this webinar? What are you going back to? Like, open up the template and drop the headline into the value story template today. And that can be your first step. Because I think it's so easy, like any of these things, like your manager isn't going to be like, where's your value story? I haven't, you need to update it. No one other than you is going to keep you accountable for something like this. That's really going to help shape your career and help shape your, personal and professional marketability. So I would say like you are the stakeholder for this, and you are the only one that's going to keep you accountable. So like get started today and have that be that, that immediate first step that's going to set you down a path of having a stronger and more memorable value story that you can use. And I do think it's going to make your life a little easier when you have to make those, when you are, in a situation like when you're ready to submit for that promotion or maybe pivot in your career. You don't want to have to, like, on top of all the other stuff floating through your mind, you don't want to have to start to build this from scratch. So your future self, I would say your future self is going to thank you for starting today.
Susanna, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I think this is going to be really impactful, really valuable for our admin audience. And I am excited for everyone to start building their personal value stories.
It's been a pleasure. I can't wait to see your personal value stories out in the wild, out on LinkedIn. I can't wait to see what you all come up with.
What a valuable session with Susanna. I'm so excited for all of you to get started on building your personal value story and finding those places to share it, whether it's Twitter, LinkedIn, your resume. Start to build your personal value story today. All of those resources Susanna mentioned, like the template, will be linked in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining today's Expert Corner, and make sure to subscribe to our Salesforce Admins YouTube channel so you never miss a video like this, and visit us at admin.salesforce.com for more content that's built just for you, our Salesforce admins. Thank you, and see you next time.